Now that we've gotten our introduction out of the way, let's get into the human digestive system. We're going to start with the components, then we'll go through the process. The first term I need you to know is alimentary canal, which is just a fancy word that means the complete digestive system. So you can look at a bunch of different organisms here. They all have alimentary canals: an earthworm, a bird, an insect. The total digestive system from mouth to anus, that's the alimentary canal. Associated with the alimentary canal are a bunch of accessory glands. These are exocrine structures that are going to secrete digestive juices and enzymes and other stuff into the alimentary canal via ducts. So you have structures that make a specific material connected to specific locations in that digestive system, so they will secrete into those specific places. So these are exocrine secretions. In the human digestive system, we're going to see salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder as our accessory glands. While not a physical component of the system, an important functional component of the system is peristalsis. We've mentioned this before in the context of movement in a hydrostatic skeleton. In the context of digestion, peristalsis refers to waves of contractions in smooth muscle that are going to move food through your digestive system. And an example we can see right here is swallowing. So this is the food. This tube is the esophagus, which we'll describe in more detail soon. But basically, we have smooth muscle, and when you swallow, it's going to contract from top to bottom, which is going to push the food down the esophagus into the stomach. The final component that we'll mention as we go through these steps are sphincters. Sphincters are ring-like muscular valves. Basically, they're circular muscles that when they contract, they close the door between two different compartments of the digestive system. So, like right here, there is a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. So these circular muscles are going to be really important for regulating movement of food through the digestive system. Now we'll follow the passage of food through the human digestive system step by step. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the process, I just want to point out these two figures. It's actually one figure. It's figure 41.9, but it has two distinct parts here. On the left, we have kind of a cartoon version of a human body. You could see all the different components of the system as they look kind of in real life. But I really like this schematic version on the right because it shows all of the components of the system and how they are connected to and functionally associated with each other without all of the needless detail that's in this version. So this is a much neater and I think much more useful version when it comes to understanding how this system works. It also has some nifty color coding. The alimentary canal, the actual tube where the food goes, is in white, and the accessory glands are in this kind of pale purple. Human food processing actually starts before ingestion. It's triggered by the nervous system, and before we even put anything in our mouths, we have the stimulation of our salivary glands. Now, we're not going to get into today what that regulatory framework looks like. We're going to do that next time when we talk about nutrition. One of the things we're going to talk about there is how we regulate digestion and appetite. So we'll get into that next time. But for today, I just want you to know that the process actually starts before we actually eat anything. In the actual process itself, it starts obviously in your mouth or your oral cavity. This is where we accomplish ingestion, so we get food into our body through our mouth. And the process of digestion actually starts in the mouth as well. So we have mechanical digestion via the teeth, which means we just use part of the body to physically break up our food into smaller pieces. So that's mechanical digestion. And there's also chemical digestion in the form of salivary amylases. These are enzymes that break down carbohydrates into smaller sugars. We're not going all the way to monosaccharides yet, but we'll make smaller sugars from larger polysaccharides. One interesting specific thing you're doing is you're taking things like starch and glycogen, and among the series of polysaccharides you're breaking them down into, you generate maltose. Now, maltose is actually perceived as sweet. So one experiment you can do to actually yourself detect the effects of salivary amylases is if you eat like something that's very plain, like a cracker, and you just chew it in your mouth for a few minutes without swallowing it, eventually it's going to start to taste sweet because you're taking that starch and you're breaking it down into maltose, which you perceive as tasting sweet. Your salivary glands are also secreting mucus into your mouth, which contains mucins. These are glycoproteins that are very slippery, and this is important to move the food through your mouth, your throat, and your esophagus without damaging any of those tissues. We've all done the thing where we swallow a potato chip that was too sharp and just a little bit too big and it hurts in your throat when you swallow it. The point of mucins is to keep that from happening by lubricating your food so it moves smoothly down to your stomach. An important structure involved in this process is the tongue, which is moving the food throughout your mouth, helping facilitate mechanical digestion, and it's also going to form the food into a mass called the bolus, and this is what's actually going to move down your esophagus into your stomach. Before it gets to the esophagus, this bolus has to pass through the pharynx. Now, this is a little bit weird because the pharynx is part of the digestive system and the respiratory system. You can see in this figure, we have the pharynx here. This is where we have our mouth leading into our esophagus, but it's also our nasal cavity passage leading down into our trachea, which leads to our lungs. So we have two different systems using the same kind of crossroads here, which can lead to problems. The way we deal with this is with this structure called the epiglottis, right here. So we have our bolus. This is our food that we have chewed up, and now we're going to swallow it. When we swallow, the esophageal sphincter relaxes and permits that food to move through the pharynx into the esophagus. So that's our first sphincter that's regulating the passage of food. At the same time, the epiglottis, which is usually up to permit breathing, it has the air passage open, it flips into a downward position, which blocks the trachea so that your food cannot go down into your respiratory system. Occasionally, if you are doing something like talking or laughing while you're ingesting something, your food can go down into your trachea, and that can be quite dangerous because obviously that can lead to choking. If you've ever experienced the phenomenon of taking a drink and it going down the wrong pipe, so to speak, and causing a coughing fit, that's what happened here. You were maybe laughing or something as you took a sip of a beverage, and then that liquid went down your trachea, the wrong pipe, and you coughed until you got it out of there. After the pharynx, your food moves into the esophagus, which is the muscular tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. Here it is highlighted in red right here. That's your esophagus. In the esophagus, the bolus is going to move to the stomach via peristalsis, like I mentioned earlier. So it's a muscular tube, it has smooth muscle, and that's going to contract in a wave from top to bottom, pushing the food down as it goes. An interesting note here is that the esophagus is not exclusively smooth muscle, because swallowing is something you control voluntarily. So the top of the esophagus is actually skeletal muscle that's under voluntary control, and once you start the process of swallowing, then it transitions to smooth muscle, which is done automatically down the rest of that distance. At the bottom of the esophagus, there is a structure called the cardiac sphincter that regulates the passage of food from the esophagus into the stomach. So we have another valve there that's a circular muscle, and that opens when you swallow to permit the food to move down into the stomach. The rest of the time, you want that valve to be closed. If the cardiac sphincter is open at the wrong time, that can lead to heartburn because the acidic juices in the stomach, the gastric juices that we'll talk about in a few minutes, those can move up into the esophagus. Now, your stomach is protected to some degree against the harsh environment created by that acid. The pH is about 2, but your esophagus is not. So when that contents gets up into your esophagus, that's painful, and that's heartburn. After the esophagus, the next organ in the pathway is the stomach. The stomach is a really interesting, highly elastic organ. When it's empty, it's very small, but it has a capacity of approximately 2 liters on average in a person, give or take. This is important because it means you can eat a large meal and store that meal in your stomach, and you don't have to be eating constantly. Now, as we'll see, this is a relatively harsh environment, so the lining is one of the fastest replicating tissues in your body. That entire lining is basically always undergoing cell division, and it's replaced in its entirety about every 3 days. The lining of the stomach is not just a simple protective layer of cells, though. There are secretions that need to go into the stomach that are generated by the cells of that lining. It has these pits in it, which are called tubular gastric glands. So once again, we have this infolding of the otherwise flat surface of the lining of the stomach. And if you are folding inwards, what are you increasing? Excellent, you're increasing the surface area. So by using these structures, these tubular gastric glands, we're increasing the amount of stuff that can be secreted into the stomach. The stuff that we're going to secrete here is called gastric juices, and these are the things that are going to do chemical digestion in the stomach. There are 3 distinct types of cells involved in this process. The first is mucus cells, which are shown in red here. These are going to secrete a protective mucus that's going to coat the lining of the stomach to keep it safe from the otherwise dangerous acidic environment. In pink, we have chief cells. These are going to secrete a protein called pepsinogen, which is the inactive precursor to an enzyme called pepsin, and we'll see how that works in just a minute. The third types of cells are called parietal cells. These pump protons into the lumen of the stomach, and they allow chloride ions to diffuse out. When those two things meet in the lumen of the stomach, they make hydrochloric acid, which of course is very dangerous. Because hydrochloric acid is such a strong acid, you can't just have like vacuoles storing HCl in your cells. So you have to keep the protons and the chloride ions separate, and then when you need them, you secrete them both together. The chloride ions are going to diffuse out. They have to use channels. It's facilitated diffusion because they're ions, but they're going to diffuse outwards into the lumen of the stomach, and the protons are going to be pumped outwards using proton pumps. The HCl is extremely important functionally for digestion to occur in the stomach. It does 3 things basically. The pH of the stomach during digestion is about 2 because of all this hydrochloric acid present. That acts as an antimicrobial, so there is very little that's going to survive the environment in your stomach. And this is why most probiotic nutritional supplements are basically scams. Most things that you ingest are going to be killed by that hydrochloric acid in your stomach. I don't want to say there's nothing that's going to survive there, because obviously there are microbes that can survive the environment in your stomach and make it to your intestines. Some of these microbes are actually really nasty parasites that can cause things like diarrhea. But for the most part, like if you eat probiotic yogurt, for example, none of that stuff is going to survive the really acidic environment in your stomach. There is some acid in something like yogurt, so there's bacteria that make lactic acid, but the pH of that is not very acidic at all, and if you put those same bacteria in the environment in your stomach at a pH of 2, they all get killed and they never make it to your intestines. So just keep that in mind, that most of this probiotic stuff and this stuff that's supposed to like affect your gut microbiome, anything that you ingest through your mouth, that's mostly going to be killed by the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. So just be aware of that. The second thing that this hydrochloric acid accomplishes is it denatures proteins. And this is really important for breaking down proteins because most proteins are going to be these dense masses that are very tightly bound together. Now, it's really hard for enzymes that would break amino acids apart to get in there if it's a really dense mass. But that HCl is going to disrupt things like hydrogen bonds that keep that protein in its kind of final structure. If you can unwind it, you denature it, now you make that strand available for enzymes that can cut it. The third thing that HCl does is also related to breaking down proteins. It's converting pepsinogen into an enzyme called pepsin, which is the main digestive enzyme in the stomach. And the way this works is a really interesting positive feedback loop. So look at this figure. We're going to follow steps 1, 2, and 3 here. Step 1, we're going to secrete chloride ions and protons to make HCl. We're also going to secrete pepsinogen. That HCl is going to react with the pepsinogen to generate pepsin, the active version of that enzyme. Now that enzyme cuts proteins. So one thing it does is it's going to cut pepsinogen into more pepsin. So the more pepsin you have, as long as you're releasing pepsinogen, you're just going to keep generating more and more pepsin. So it's a positive feedback loop, amplifying the amount of pepsin present to facilitate digestion. Specifically, we are digesting proteins using pepsin because pepsin is a type of enzyme called an endopeptidase. That just means it's an enzyme that breaks peptide bonds. It's a peptidase in the middle of a chain. So it's not taking one amino acid off of either end. It's cutting in the middle of a polypeptide chain. So the result of pepsin activity in the stomach is your denatured proteins are broken down into smaller polypeptides. We're not all the way to single amino acids yet. We'll finish that process in the small intestine, but we're getting there starting in the stomach. At this point, we have a material called chyme, and that's how you pronounce this. This is called chyme. This is what is in your stomach when your stomach is done doing digestion. It has the consistency of a very thick soup, and it is highly acidic with a pH of about 2. It's a mixture of partially digested carbohydrates from your mouth, small polypeptides, which were digested in your stomach, and then undigested material that we haven't even started breaking down yet. The chyme is going to move from your stomach through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. So we can see your stomach right here. We already talked about the cardiac sphincter at the front end. At the back end of the stomach, we have the pyloric sphincter that regulates passage of that chyme into the small intestine. The last thing we'll talk about in this section before we change gears a little bit is what goes on in the small intestine. The small intestine is about 6 meters long, but it's called small because it has a smaller diameter than the large intestine. The small intestine has 3 divisions. So we have the duodenum or duodenum. I've heard it pronounced both ways. You could say it however you want. That's the uppermost part or the first part of the small intestine. It's right here in yellow. That's where most chemical digestion occurs. Then we have the jejunum, which is the middle section, and the ileum, which is the lower portion that connects with the large intestine. The primary thing going on in those 2 parts of the small intestine is nutrient absorption. So at this point, we're going to pause, we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about how we digest specific nutrients.